Hey wise people, and welcome back to another episode of our Wise Words book reviews. Apologies for the delay in uploading this week. There have been a couple of things going on in the background, so it's been a little tricky to stick to our normal schedule. Today, however, we are reviewing The Myth of Mental Illness by Dr Thomas Szasz, which gives a critique of the psychiatric field and tries to explain why there is no such thing as mental illness. Now, as you can tell by the title of this episode and this book, this is quite the controversial book. We mean no offence, but we thought it might be interesting to review it and see how it compares with the mainstream idea of therapeutics and psychiatry. Dr. Szasz's main point about mental illness is that it refers to the mind, which is not a biological construct but a mere abstraction of the brain, thus suggesting there is no such thing as mental illness, as any illness must be biological. How this biological illness may have started is a different matter. The book is based around the concept of diagnosing something based on a biological or environmental cause. How do you tell which is having an effect on the individual, and how should one go about helping that individual? A drug for a biological cause or therapy for an environmental one? In this episode, we touch on many topics such as incentives to diagnose, free will in regard to overcoming an illness, drugs and whether they are a solution, and much, much more. I do recommend you give it a listen. If anything, it just makes you question the system that we take so freely for granted. Whether he is right in his observations, it is an interesting listen that I guarantee will spark a bit of interest. And remember, if you do like it, make sure you give us a thumbs up, leave a comment, or make our day by subscribing to our channel. I hope you enjoy. So, probably quite the controversial book.
Probably the most controversial, I'd have to say.
I think the one that we've done so far, and probably very, not necessarily relevant, but probably very controversial at this time.
Yeah. I think it's pretty intense, isn't it? I mean, it's in the title, The Myth of Mental Illness. He's essentially claiming that, mental illness itself is a myth. But he's claiming it in a way that, that sounds like quite a clickbaity title, doesn't it, really? He's not saying that mental problems don't exist. He's basically arguing, the main thesis of the entire book is that if you define illness in terms of a biological phenomena, which is damaging or stopping cells from functioning the normal way, can mental illness be classified in the same breadth as that? Is it really actually a cellular issue? Or is it a behavioural issue, which is kind of his main sort of angle of argument?
Yeah. It's interesting because you think the idea that we use for a disease is a biological.
Yeah.
And yet the mind is not biological. The brain is. The mind is a manifestation of how your brain works. There's while I'm speaking to you right now, there's 6 parts of my brain that are activated, and them all coming together creates what we conceive as, the mind, and my mind of thinking and communicating, speech and everything like that. So they can't, if we're using that definition of something biologically altered as a disease, then we can't apply that to an abstract kind of concept of what we conceive of as the mind.
Yeah.
And I think that's his kind of point that he's trying to get at.
Yeah. I'm going to quote him here just so it makes it a bit easier. So, my claim that mental illnesses are fictitious illnesses is also not based on scientific research. It rests on the materialist scientific definition of illness as a pathological alteration of cells, tissues, and organs. If we accept this scientific definition of disease, then it follows that mental illness is a metaphor, which is the more I think about it, it kind of does make sense, doesn't it? A lot of, especially when it comes to the diagnosis of mental illness as well, it tends to be a diagnosis is from the symptoms, which is usually behavioral.
Yeah.
They can't function correctly in terms of they exhibit this response to a particular stimulus, or they have an overreaction to specific things, or almost defined as crazy in a sense as well. The argument then is it actually neurological? Is it actually in the sort of here you go, this is what he talks about and said. It says, is it a physiochemical alteration? So is it actually the biology that's been altered, or is it a psychosocial communication issue, which is like, I guess is a really sort of jargon orientated way of just saying, is it a behavioral and like social issue rather than a biological issue?
But that's what's that's what's interesting, because what is our biology and our environment constantly impact each other. There could be something that is biologically wrong, which is causing a certain behavior, and then that behavior interacting with our environment causes another kind of feedback loop. So everything's kind of so intertwined, and to try and find the cause or origin of a misbehavior, let's say, it's hard to pinpoint whether it's biological or whether it's behavioral. And which is quite interesting. And I think his point is that we constantly try to solve everything from as if it's from a biological root, and that takes ownership of the individual.
Yeah. I was about to say, you can kind of understand why that is an approach, because if you think of everything stems from the biology underlying, right? If like we are to like think of ourselves as a group of cells, technically everything that ever happens or we ever do is based off that from a fundamental like first principle basis. So I can understand the attraction of that idea, like, oh, the biology leads to this, that leads to that, therefore if we treat the biology, we treat the individual. But in terms of the way we operate, in terms of, I don't know if you do some sort of self-reflection, a lot of the way you operate and act is based off your personal memories, your personal experiences. So there's a lot to do with the individual themselves and not the biology of the individual. Like, we all have similar biology, but we all have our own different experiences and different ways of encoding experience. And therefore his argument is that, like, although there could be a biological issue, it's usually the experiential issue of the way we represent things to ourselves, the way the rules we've learned as we've grown older, that is more of a cause towards this sort of mental illness than the biology. And that isn't to say that there isn't, like, for example, like if you look into sort of the depression stuff, and in terms of like a lack of neurotransmitter, is it serotonin? I can't remember which one it is, but anyway, there is
which one
for depression in general. Is it
is it serotonin? Lack of dopamine as well, I think.
Okay, yeah. So there is like a biological underpinning of why people are feeling sad, like that. I guess he's not even arguing against that, but like, that exists. But he's arguing like what happens before that to make that biological reaction normal. Like, how is this person structuring their mind, or like the way they see things? So like, how are they comparing themselves to others? You know what I mean? Like that type of thing, and that leads to this like cycle of negativity almost.
And I think he extrapolates that to the whole kind of idea of mental illness in itself. It's like you can't claim that just any kind of misbehavior is just a mental illness. And kind of specificity and clarity is needed in order to kind of break it down and pinpoint what the actual cause of something is. If we just straight away bypass all of that and go straight to assuming that, well, it's a mental illness, and so something biologically must be wrong.
It's like a bucket definition of like, okay, so this person is exhibiting this behavior, therefore they are in this bucket of depression, like, and then we treat them with the same thing, when in reality this person's specific instance of why they're depressed is the thing that needs to be addressed, not the depression itself. Obviously the depression needs to be treated, but the specific reason for why the depression is there needs to be talked about, addressed, and solved. And his argument there is that, like, a lot of this stuff is actually not just, like we just said, biological. It's also like the psychosocial elements, sort of like their beliefs, their values. So he makes his argument that, like, in general, psychiatry should be around goals and values. And that, because at the end of the day, especially when you look at it in terms of like diagnosing a mental illness, is usually to do with personal conduct, like the things that you're witnessing as their actions and their behavior, to then diagnose them with a biological illness. So when it comes to actions and behavior, what is guiding those actions and behavior? Is it the actual biology, which some of it is, once again, but is it also their goals, values, and sort of what they're trying to achieve, or the rules they abide by as an individual?
And I think, like, if you were to only assume that everything is biological and nothing is in your control and you have free will to change it, then it means that you end up being dependent on a solution rather than being self-dependent and being able to solve some of the issues yourself. And it is difficult because to try and pinpoint what percentage of a certain behavior is biological or environmental, it's hard to extract that and compartmentalize that. You know, what percentage is which, or which started
Yeah,
it,
yeah.
and then
I
obviously
think it's
once
very
something
imprecise,
starts, it
isn't it?
proliferates into many other things. So it's hard to try and track that back to the origin, but it's needed. Otherwise, we end up just jumping over all of that and just assuming. And what does assuming do, Jess?
Makes an ass out of you and me. The old classic.
Oh gosh.
I think one of the interesting as well. One of the main reasons I think he's so anti this idea of mental illness is because he sees it as like a political weapon.
Yeah.
So one of the first things I picked up on what he was saying was like he talks about this he calls it the ethical injunction of psychiatry, and it's like, so when it comes to like medical treatments, the patient is allowed to agree, disagree with the diagnosis and accept or unaccept the treatment, right? They have like freedom to be like, I don't want that treatment. I don't like, you may have diagnosed me this, but I'm free to decide whether I'm going to act on what you're telling me. Whereas his point here is when you get when you get labeled as mentally ill, you can become dangerous to yourself and others, and therefore the doctor is then making a decision for you. So you're basically,
because you supposedly can't make the right decision.
Exactly. So you're curtailing, and once again, like there's a spectrum. I'm sure there's some people out there absolutely like, they probably cannot function in society. I've never met somebody like that because it's been kept well aware of my well away from my life, etc. Right, and I'm making up assumptions here from movies and stuff. Right, you wouldn't. I've never met somebody like it. But at the same time, it's this idea that beforehand, it's you have the freedom to choose. With the mental illness sort of area, you don't have the freedom to choose because you can be seen as dangerous to others or dangerous to yourself. Therefore, somebody else makes the decision for you, which is, is a bit different. And that's why he's so against it, because he also sees it as, from my other notes here, he talks about how with disease in general, they are discovered, so they are found. They go into the sort of body, the whatever, and they see the fact there's been damage to the cells, etc. They can actually like discover what's happening. Whereas he talks about with the mental illnesses, they kind of like invent diseases or invent things on top of the behavior that they don't like, or like, oh, he's behaving this way, so they invent something. So like, I mean, I don't know much about ADHD or whatever, but you can then argue that just, okay, right, so he's showing symptoms, he's showing that he can't keep their attention somewhere, right, whatever. And all of a sudden that then becomes a disease. It becomes something that people can't help. It becomes a debilitating, like almost a disability, sorry. And he talks about this idea that once it becomes a disability, it's like weaponized. Because then if you go to somebody and they diagnose you with ADHD, let's just say, or maybe even like any type of medical diagnosis or mental diagnosis, you then have that label on you for life. And you then sort of get labeled. Once you get labeled, you get mistreated. You come to believe it yourself. There is an idea of this, like once you get labeled, there's plenty of evidence to show that, like, in the social sciences, I believe, it's when like a kid is labeled as like a bright young student, the teacher automatically starts behaving in a way that treats them as a bright young student. Whereas somebody who's seen as like a reprobate, or somebody who just, or sluggish, lazy, slow, they get treated like that. But then also it's funny because if you think about the way you build up self-identity, right, you would be classified as delusional if you created your own self-identity and whatever people told you, you're like, nah, it's not true. I am like, the God.
I'm the best.
God. I'm the best. And like, it's like those people go on X Factor, and absolutely shocking. And they're like, oh my God, like, I just thought I was amazing. The point is, your identity is almost formed as like a cross communication between you and other people. So you get feedback from other people and it lets you know, right? So you almost, like the self-fulfilling prophecy, you almost, once you're labeled as this thing, you then start exhibiting more behaviors like it. And then it also becomes an excuse. It becomes like I couldn't do that because, I have ADHD. And then what happens? And then what gets worse from this is you get to that point where, all of a sudden you're labeled, you've got this problem. But then obviously, instead of it being behavioral and thinking like, okay, what is causing this? Maybe they're just not interested in the type of things you're trying to show them. They need more stimulus in a different sort of area. You then just start going, okay, it's biological. So how do we do this? We give them drugs to enhance their focus. We give them this, next thing you know, they've been taking that drug for ages. They're almost dependent on it. And that's one of his central arguments here as well, is like, once it becomes medicalized, the treatment becomes medicalized, you then have to consistently be using the treatment to like function properly. and it just spirals out. And then also the other point he makes is the sort of bucket widens. So like, you know, I guess the more people that get diagnosed as well, right? The more other people go, oh god, he got diagnosed. Maybe I'm on the spectrum. But once again, if there's a spectrum, you're all somewhere along the line. So like,
but
I
this
love
is
that.
the
So
thing with like
yeah.
is that, you know, there is that spectrum, there is that continuum, but it's branched in a category. And so, you know, someone who's like at the lower end could still be considered the same as someone who's on the higher end, because it's like, oh, well, you have this problem, you know, and by insinuating that it is biological, it's something that you can't really change, or like, because, well, a lot of drugs, they help to alleviate the symptoms, but they don't necessarily, like, you know, solve it or cure the actual root problem.
To be honest, I just want to actually just say we're not actually saying the drugs don't work. Like, they do work for treating the stuff that's actually happening. It's just, is that the overall ultimate solution to the problems we face? Like, okay, right, everything, just take a pill. Like, you know.
Because this is it. If something, let's say, is being caused by your environment, and then that's having an effect on your biology, which is having an effect on your behavior, that kind of thing, then if you only sort out the biological aspect of it, that environmental stimulus is still there. Mm-hmm. And so, okay, you may be like dampening the reaction that you're having, but the environment stimulus is still there, and it's kind of you know, this ties into a lot of
and the structure that causes
stuff
that reaction.
like that. It's so it's like, you know, if you want to stop eating biscuits, then don't leave biscuits around, you know. But you could take a drug that makes you stop wanting to have biscuits, but your biscuits are still there, and so there's still that kind of, you know, you're not actually changing your environment at all, even though that is like the origin source of certain things. But
I do think as well, like, in regards to the environment, like, if you think about actually what a lot of the psychological stuff is all about, sort of rule behavior and interpreting stimulus, if that makes any sense to you. So like, a lot of it's to do with your past experiences, the way you structure the world, or the way you see things. Like, if you had a lot of bad experiences with a particular type of person, then your reality is structured around every time you see that person, you're going to have this negative feeling, and taking the drugs to dampen. So the structure's there, right? So every time you see this person, you're feeling a bit like maybe scared, I guess would be one way of thinking of it, or anxious. And by taking the drugs, you're dampening the reaction, but the structure's still there. So instead of dealing with it and realizing, so like, you know how he talks about, like, Peterson talks a lot about it, but in general, one of the most effective ways to treat like trauma or like sort of phobias is that sort of exposure therapy, where you slowly expose yourself to it. Dampening down, it's not going to help you expose yourself to it, if that makes any sense. You need to sort of be there, fully feel the emotion, and slowly like get over it, if that makes any sense.
But also, it sensitizes you to it. So it's like, if you were to ever, like you were saying before, if you were to ever suddenly come off, well, then you'd be very sensitive to that stimulus, and it'd be heightened sensitivity because you haven't been dealing with it, and it's been present in front of you for the whole time. And once again, we're talking about, you know, let's say there is that person that's present there, and you are anxious. A drug is hitting a point of your brain that is to reduce that anxiety, not to reduce that anxiety for that specific person in that specific context. So if you think that you're taking a drug that is like a blanket rule and is applicable to lots of contexts, well, then it's reducing anxiety in loads of other areas, rather than just for that one person. It's not like a drug is manufactured personally just for you for that one thing. You know, that person is still there, and you've got a drug that reduces, let's say in this scenario, your anxiety,
overall sensitivity,
but it also reduces your anxiety in other areas, which means, and sometimes anxiety is actually beneficial. We do need it. It is like a biological thing that's evolved over millions of years.
I was literally about to argue that, saying like, you have to realize that or at least I think, my personal opinion is that, you know, the emotions have evolved for a reason. Like, pain evolved, obviously, to, you know, if you put your hand on a hot stove, you remove it immediately, because otherwise you're going to cause some serious damage. So what's anxiety there, apart from to make you be conscious and realize that something's not quite right? Is like it's almost like it's a sensitivity to the world, being like, hang on a second, I've never seen this situation before, or if I have, it was a scary situation in the past, so therefore feel anxiety to be like, okay, be cautious. Do you get what I mean? It's like an alarm signal. It's like an alarm signal to be like, okay, hang on a second here, you could be in trouble, or there's not you've never experienced this before, so maybe you should be careful. And if you look at it from that lens, then chronic anxiety is a problem, but anxiety
Yeah,
itself
absolutely.
isn't a problem.
But and
Anxiety is
we
actually
talked about
yeah
that before in terms of like being specific. Like when you were talking about, once you're labeled with something, well, then it's kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. You act in that way, then people treat you in that way,
yeah
and it's very different that by saying like, oh, I have I have anxiety, or I have anxiety when I go into this context and I see this person. Because then it's very different. You talk about one person, thousands of people, and it's not the same with all those 999.
Well, it's not even just that; it's separating it from your identity. So, like, it becomes. This actually talks about shattered assumptions, like the ability to. So that's it. One of the things about trauma victims is, do they ever take the trauma as something that happened as a mistake from their behavior, or is it them themselves? Like separating the behavior from the individual. So, like what you're just saying there, like anxiety, are you an anxious person? Are you somebody who goes like, I'm really anxious, or are you somebody who goes, I feel anxious when this specific thing happens? Because I think I don't know if this is actual treatment for it, but in my head a valid treatment could be like, every time you feel anxious you document when and why, or like it's fine, you won't know why, you just document, when I was in this situation I was feeling anxious,
specific context.
And then you start making a journal of exactly what it was, and then you kind of realize maybe like, what is the similarities between all these situations? Maybe it's a social situation, so you're anxious about what people think of you. But then you can start dealing with why you're anxious. You're dealing with people, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But it's just interesting to know that like it's a difference between separating the anxiety from you as a person, these specific actions. And I have to say, it's interesting when you, like, for example, if I have like a really heavy night now, and obviously they talk about how if you after drinking your what is this? Probably serotonin, one of the neurotransmitters. Anyway, the happy feelings go away and you feel a bit depressed, right? I've noticed that when I'm feeling in that area, like down a little bit, I do think that criticisms of myself, if in my head, do actually spread to a more general than the specific, which is really interesting.
Yeah.
Because that, once again, this is actually the argument for why it is biological to a degree, because it's very hard, I find, when you're in that mood to try and separate you being like not a bad person, but if you're feeling really down, you start questioning other things that aren't related rather than specific behavior. Which just goes to show that they are linked.
No, absolutely.
And yeah, I'm trying to think of a natural segue into wait, this is it. So yeah, back to that in terms of what were we saying? In terms of separating from the individual to the very specific. It reminds me, he talked about this part where it was to do with kids and anxiety. So he was saying that, like, a child being left alone and feeling anxious is open to two different interpretations. So one of them can be like, it's bad because he's very susceptible or sensitive to being unloved because he's so anxious when he's alone. Or it can be good saying, oh, he is impelled or motivated because of this anxiety to make more connections with people. So his anxiety leads to, and this is what the primary thing, which I think is really interesting, is this idea that when it comes to behavior in particular and sort of ways of, or feelings, they can be viewed as both good and bad. Like this is back to what we were saying a minute ago with the anxiety. Like, it can be viewed, anxiety is not very nice to feel, but it serves a purpose. So you can look at it in two completely separate ways. And it's the same with like behavior as well. Like, oh, he acted like this and it's really bad right now, but in the future he's learnt from it, so it's a good thing. So you can always reinterpret anything as good or bad, if that makes any sense. And it's just quite interesting because, for example, like back to this kid having anxiety, let's just say the parent brings their kid into the psychiatrist, goes, oh my God, every time I leave my son or daughter, they are just so anxious. They just don't want to meet other kids. And like, fine, that could be a problem. But there's a problem more to the parent because the parents gets annoyed that the kid's just there trying to like call them back or whatever. But in reality, it could also be interpreted as like, right, he's got this like motive. Now we need to channel it into something else and not punish them for feeling that motive. Like, I feel like a lot of people are probably punished as kids for like wanting to be clingy to their parents. Like, oh, you just leave me alone. Like, that type of thing.
And I think also what's interesting is like going back to your point that you said earlier on is in like, if someone gets diagnosed and then you suddenly do something that's similar, it's like, well, should I get diagnosed? I don't know if that's the exact thinking, but it would. I do think people call things very early, as in like something happens and it's like, oh, that needs to get treated straight away. You know, we
Ooh.
need to get like it
Yeah.
sorted right away and get like, you know, a diagnosis or if there's anything wrong. But then the thing is that what I found interesting in this book is he was saying that, you know, you're going to a place that is slightly incentivized to diagnose.
Mm.
So, and he gives it an example of like, I think a woman who gets slapped, okay, and the actual action or the, you know, the pain, for instance, communicates to the husband like, oh, you don't love me, that kind of thing, whereas it communicates to the psychiatrist that like, oh, I think he was talking about like neuralgia, facial neuralgia or something. My point being is in like everyone's got their own perspective and they're all kind of incentivized to see something in a certain way depending on their career, their position, you know, their actual knowledge. And so if you go into something or somewhere, let's say you go and see a psychiatrist, they have a world of knowledge that they're going to be looking at all the signs through. So if if you start having facial pain, they might be like, well, I would know that in my knowledge, facial pain means this. Whereas someone who's, you know, an economist, I don't think he's really going to look at facial pain.
No, but I completely get what you mean. Is you view the world through their own lenses and their own categories. And this actually leads me, just on this quick note, is this idea that, you know, categories themselves and classification of like diagnoses and classification of things, or like giving language or names to things, is not God-given. It's not the real thing. It's like we as a human species have come up with these words to describe things and have like created these buckets to categorize certain things in. And then, okay, what do you do when you're at university? You study the categories and rules and structuring of reality, because that's essentially what it is when you start categorizing and making rules of things. You learn a specific way of doing it. Therefore, if you're a psychiatrist, you're going to look at, like you just said, the face slap as this like disease or whatever that they've figured out. Whereas the woman's just gone, oh fucking hell! Like, so what actually happened? Did the woman get slapped?
I can't remember, but basic note was that like people can perceive things differently depending on.
Okay,
like,
so but basically, just for this, did she get slapped herself or did she slap her husband?
I think.
Because basically, the way I was going to frame it is, let's just say she slapped her husband. So her perception of the world is, my husband pissed me off. I absolutely whacked him. And then they're like, fucking hell, some sort of complex disease. You know what I mean? Like that she's not quite right. She slapped her husband. But that's an extravagant and obviously probably not realistic interpretation. But it just goes to show that people have their different ways of perceiving things. Just like, you know, if, let's just say you study accounting, all of a sudden, you know, everything comes about money. Like, oh my god, this costs this, you know, this, so I can offset this against tax. Fantastic. Like, you know,
this is it. And I think he even gives like another example of like someone who has like a tight chest and a pain that leads to their shoulder. And this goes back to what we always say in terms of categories, as in like some will always see it in a different way. A molecule for like a physicist or a chemist is like slightly different. And so he was saying, you know, someone who's I don't even know the different types of professionals in the medical industry, but he was saying like this person would view it like this, but this person would view it like that, and they're all different diagnoses. And what's interesting is when you have behavior, it can be interpreted in many different ways.
As we just literally said, in terms of like, you know, it could be good or bad depending on the result, and also what's the goal of the person who's acting that way, or what rules are they following. And this is the whole point. And like, I think one of his actual main arguments as well in this book, weirdly, is that a lot of this diagnosis and expansion of diseases or mental diseases, like in terms of, you know, not creating, but inventing new diseases to classify specific behaviors that are like a bit different to others, right, is actually expanding the power of psychiatry. Because if they can see and diagnose more problems and then therefore solve more problems, they have more power in the general political, in the world in general, because they can charge for their services, and they can also, like, you know, like being able to classify and diagnose people is a pretty big power, especially as we just said. If you label ADHD, you can like ruin kids' lives. Like, not ruin, but you can severely impact the way they're treated by other people for the rest of their life. It's a very powerful position. He actually argues a lot of it is political, and like in a lot of it is professional.
He calls psychiatry a branch of law rather than science. Because he says, like, you know, they have a ridiculous amount of power. They're like policemen. They can, you know, suddenly put someone in jail or put someone in a mental house.
It's like, and And it's quite interesting as well. He talks about this idea that it's funny that when you walk into a psychiatrist or a psychologist, I'm butchering, but psychiatry is the main argument for this, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
If you walk in and you're speaking in the language of your symptoms or your complaints, the way you're feeling, they are taking your complaints and your feelings and they're turning it into an illness, or they're talking the language of like some level of systematic problem with you, so they can then present you a solution. So you're actually speaking two different languages. You're speaking how you're feeling, what's going wrong. They're speaking, okay, this means this. This is the diagnosis of the illness that you now have because of these symptoms. Yeah. But then he also argues this idea like you can't just generalize from symptoms. So like, for example, like, how many illnesses have the same symptoms, right? So like coronavirus, right? Apart from, okay, the one thing that it has is very distinct smell and taste. If it didn't have the distinct symptom, you could never tell it from the normal flu unless, of course, you went deep in and sort of did a proper PCR test or whatever the most accurate test is. But the point here is, just because you had these symptoms doesn't mean you have the disease that they're diagnosing you for. And people forget it's such an imperfect, I was going to say science, but from what I can see, at least, it's not even a fucking science because it's not material. And most of science is materialistic. And actually, that's another point later in the book where he talks about like, there is ways to know things materially and there's also ways to know things experientially. And you can know things differently, right? But his argument here, once again, is the experiential is being turned into the material. And we're basically saying, it's biological, but we don't even, there's no proof.
But also think about it, like that, your generalizations are based on what you know, isn't it? So if you went and saw, a surgeon, or you went and saw like a psychiatrist, they're going to have completely different knowledge. And so they're going to generalize from certain symptoms different things, which is interesting. So you could go to a psychologist and they could say this, you could go to a psychiatrist and they say something completely different because their knowledge is rooted in something completely different. And I think a lot of this book actually dives into like linguistics and breaks down a lot of the language, because it goes to show you how important it is to be specific when designing systems like this. So psychiatrists have to follow a psychiatrist like manual. I can't remember what the DSM, I think the American DSM. And diagnostics, something manual. Not actually something as the S, but anyway. But my point being is, if a system is not specific, it allows for leeway and it allows for kind of vagueness or generalizations, like you're saying. And so people that are in this system can end up interpreting things in rather vague ways, rather than if it was rooted and built on specificity. And he talks a lot about like Freud and how they broke things down, and how he almost basically didn't go far enough. Like he would kind of cut it short when he would be describing certain kind of illnesses, especially hysteria. He brings up hysteria a lot. But my point being is, it's so important then to have to make a system as specific as possible, so that it can't differ. Because as soon as it starts to go off in some other trajectory, then you're fucked. You're not going on the right diagnosis. You're not being able to diagnose people.
Because multiple different mental illnesses have the same symptoms. So unless you can specify the difference, they could fit into either bucket. And obviously, then the bucket of choice is actually what impacts them the most. I mean, there's a difference between like absolute crazy person and somebody who's on the not on the spectrum of craziness. But you can't get what I mean. Like that, depending on the symptoms you're showing, and if they cross over, how can you tell the bloody difference? And if you tell me it's a science, it's not. It's an art. And it's honest. Once again, you probably trust somebody who's solved a lot of people's problems and also been in the industry and sort of seen things more than you would somebody who's just read a textbook and gone, these are diagnoses. And this is the problem, right, in my head, because once you create this knowledge that you sort of implicitly know, you have to then articulate it. And when you articulate it, you have all these like broad general symptoms and stuff. And then the people who get trained up in the next generation read these symptoms and use them as gospel. It suddenly becomes their God, and they can't actually fathom the fact that potentially these rules, I mean, the fathom the fact that some of these things that are like stood the test of time aren't actually right. I mean, how long were we, doing the bloodletting? I always go back to like in the past, all the weird, crazy shit human beings have done.
Or
to treat things.
electrotherapy.
Yeah. How many times have we done the crazy shit in the past because we thought it worked and it turns out it didn't work in the past? Or we create some like weird theories. Like just because we've solved, we created the atom bomb and stuff doesn't mean our discoveries in this sort of what channel of science can spread out across the whole of humanity and be like, we've solved fucking everything. Because we obviously haven't. And I think about it a lot, to be honest. It's more like this idea that because we made progress in one area, we've almost then just assumed because it's like scientific in that one specific area, the science is spread across all domains, and therefore everybody who's like a scientist knows best.
But it's a level of arrogance, isn't it? And a level of certainty that no matter what science will find, it will always be correct. And
the thing is, as well,
when you incentivizes anyone to find anything to do with
this
science.
stuff, of course, it like back to like shared assumptions and like we believe everything has a meaning and everything's connected and everything makes sense, right? In my head, once you've been trained in this sort of way of thinking, you can just everything makes sense because you just know the diagnosis. Like, oh, you're feeling that way? Oh, you got this. And then everything's easy because you figured the world out. Everything works. Everything fits into your like categorization. And if something doesn't, oh, that's a special case. Like, oh,
that's an outlier.
He's a fucking crazy person. Let's put him in, like, let's put him away. And I don't.
But I think, it's interesting. It's something that I took away from this book. And I mentioned it briefly to you yesterday. But like, in the way that I saw it was like, Augustus Comte's like hierarchy of like subjects, ranges from maths, physics, chemistry, biology, psychology, sociology, and there might be a couple of others in between. But the idea is that like at the maths level, whatever answer you find is right? Like there's one answer to find. 1 + 1 = 2. But to find that answer, you have to find it out of millions of different answers, so it's very difficult. Whereas at like a psychology or sociological level, there are millions of answers that are all right. Like everything's correlative, basically. But to find the percentage significance of each one of those answers is very difficult. It's hard to find out what is specifically causing this behavior that I'm doing, And the way that I saw psychiatry in the sense is that it's in between kind of biology and psychology. Psychology is in the realm of kind of behavior and biology is biological. And when you're treating and diagnosing someone, there's one aspect there where like we're incredibly into therapeutics and making drugs. Also, it's a massive profiting business, profiting industry in America. You get where the whole world basically they make billions and billions and billions of dollars. But that aside, a psychiatrist can't really solve a behavioral problem on the spot, because a behavioral problem or something that is environmentally induced, the individual has to overcome, right? They have to be the one that approaches that person that gives them anxiety, and that's the exposure therapy, right? Like they can induce certain or do certain methods that reduce it, but it's not like a quick solution, whereas it is a quick solution, or there is one solution if you treat it on a biological level. If you have a drug for it, it's be like, oh, don't worry, we can get rid of that. We have this drug. So in a sense, it incentivizes people to, instead of working slightly on the psychological plane, to work in the biological plane and treat on a biological plane, because then you can say, well, we have a solution. There is a solution. It's much better than being like, well, there's many things that we can do on a behavioral level. But like, it's easier if we sort it out on a biological level. And so even if you're not even aware of it, it would incentivize someone who is in that industry to try and treat people on a biological level.
Also not only is it a profitable industry, but it's a lot easier to do, right? So for example, if you look at the sort of ways of treating somebody therapy, it's very time intensive and human resource intensive. So like what I mean by that is you'd have to have somebody who's well trained in helping people get through this, and it's a long and painful process because essentially it's helping people restructure and think about everything, and sort of making sure they're it just takes more time in terms of bonding as two individual humans and understanding, etc., right? Whereas it's quite easy just to be like, right, take these pills, done. It's fantastically easy, isn't it? It's like it's this idea that every problem you can just be like, here's a pill, fucking fuck off, you're done. Like it's like
Yeah.
Yeah, we just want the simple solution as well. Like, oh, I'm going to take a pill now, and everything's going to be better. But that's just a rosy
But this
idea of
is
the
it.
world.
Yeah, we want the easy solution, but it's fucking hard for someone to know, okay, well, there could be 50 different things that are impacting you right now. I
Yeah,
don't know
yeah.
which one it is. We're going to have to go through all of them. We're going to have to try and figure out what is causing this rather
Yeah,
than, oh, actually, I've got one solution here. And I think,
I mean, and there's
that will
plenty
solve
of there's
whatever it
plenty of
is.
other reasons. Like, for example, let's just say, I mean, this is me probably butchering the literature or whatever, but let's just say somebody comes in, he's like depressed all the time. You should look at other stuff like what's their drinking habits like, how many times are
Mm-hmm.
they drinking per week. You should
Yeah.
also look like what, like I also I think it'd be quite interesting if somebody just wrote out their thoughts as they were thinking them. How
Yeah.
how much are these people comparing themselves to people that are like their models or ideals?
Yeah.
Because I feel like whenever you picture yourself up against the ideal thing or the model person, you're always going to fall short. So like
Yeah.
from my understanding of like the trauma and stuff and depression in general, it's like a structured reality where everything's negative because you're always picking the comparisons which you'll never ever be quite as good as, and it's a
Yeah.
perpetual cycle of feeling down. Whereas if you can, like, back to the Shattered Assumptions book and how they overcome like traumatic experiences, they compare themselves. Let's say you're in a horrible car crash and you lost a leg, they would compare themselves to somebody who lost their arms as well as their legs, and they'd be
Yeah.
like, wow, like I actually got lucky here. Or
Yeah.
they'd reinterpret, like you'd reinterpret your life. So like, what is this whole
Changing
movement
your
of like
reference point.
what's this whole movement of like gratitude, like why daily gratitude, right? Realizing that, fair enough, you go on Instagram and you're not that person who's a six-pack abs who's in the Dubai beach having like the most expensive steak in the world, driving a Lamborghini and all these other things that everybody tells you that you should want,
Yeah.
which doesn't actually get you happiness. And then you
Yeah.
believe, oh my god, I'm just like a normal guy who goes to the pub every week, probably a bit overweight, broke my leg last week playing sport, and now I'm like bedbound and now I'm depressed because look at all these other people. But
Very
you gotta,
specific.
it's very specific. I was about to say, it almost sounds like I've got somebody in mind, but I
Yeah.
promise you, I genuinely don't.
Yeah.
But the point there being like, but then if you compared yourself to somebody, right, in terms of South Africa, all these riots at the moment, who's probably just lost everything, let's just say their family store, or just somewhere else with this absolute massive violence going on, and like every day is a fucking survival day. In that comparison reference, you are literally so well off, it's not even funny.
Yeah.
And it's this idea that maybe a lot of it should actually be. So my understanding is from all this books reading around like therapy and trauma, is a lot of the therapeutic process is open communication between you and the patient, or whatever you want to call them, and reinterpretation and discussion of their life. Do you get what I mean? Like, it's just a reframing. It's just like back to what I said earlier, where a lot of the behavior is like structured around your experiences, the things you see, what you believe of yourself from feedback from other people. And let's just say in the past, people have been pretty mean to you and you just didn't really fit in. You then have this like weird like complex where you can't really figure out where you belong and all this sort of thing. And it just requires reinterpretation. Like, why were people like that to you? Can you find an actual meaning? It's almost like a lot of it's just they're confused up top and they don't really know what's going on. And that's not everybody, but it's some.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think it's interesting when like you consider that, people aren't born like this. Like, obviously you can be born with certain behavioral deficiencies, let's put it that way. But most people just come about them. And so you have to ask, like, well, why have they come about them? Is it something that's been accumulating over time, behavior that's been accumulating? You've been in proximity of a certain environment for a long time. You can get ill like overnight, and you can get ill, I'm assuming, accumulatively as well. But my point being is, in like, these things occur and they happen. Trying to find out why they have happened is a better decision than just being like, okay, well, it's happened and we're just going to solve it.
Well, not
Rather
just
than
it's
trying to
happened. It's
track
like,
it back.
it's just like, oh, I feel anxious, so I'm just I'm gonna take a pill now because that dampens the anxiety, but it doesn't remove the if you think of it in terms of like you said, like the biology and like what triggers that anxiety. You need to figure out what's triggering it first, because realistically your emotions are a response to the environment. That's what they were meant to. Like, I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm sure some misfire, I'm sure there is some biological reason why they misfire, and that is a completely different story. But for the majority of people who actually have like functioning emotional reactions and stuff, they are there to react to specific things. So for example, a lot of the anxiety stuff usually is around like a novel experience, because your brain is then like, right, okay, I haven't seen this before, so what do I do? So that causes some form of anxiety because it's like it snaps you into consciousness almost, right? And then there's other stuff like, you know, other emotions like anger. Why did you get angry? Because something hasn't gone the way you wanted, or you've been multiply trying something and it doesn't work. But like these things are all here as like guideposts to. They're almost signals to you, like what, like you should be thinking, fuck, I've just got really anxious. Why is that? Like what about this situation is making me anxious? Like, I don't know. I mean, mate, everybody gets in it as well. Like, for example, you could be in a mood where like you don't feel like talking to people because you're really fucking tired, and you see somebody you know walking down the street, like fucking hell, I'm walking to the other side of the street. Okay, and then the person who might have clocked you might be like, oh, hang on a second, he's moved away from me. Maybe he doesn't like me. But in reality, it's just like it's not personal. It's I just can't be bothered to engage in conversation with you right now. And then it's funny because if you went to a psychiatrist and went, oh yeah, I saw somebody across the street and I walked to the other side, he'd be like, oh my God,
you're paranoid or something like
you're paranoid, you're so anxious with this person, you can't deal with social people. Like, no, I was just tired. Like, not all the time.
I think it's so interesting when you think that, like, okay, no doubt that there are biological, you know, viruses and things that can absolutely go wrong that can cause, you know, deficiencies. But think about how many things are debilitating in our society. You got social media for one, which is massive. Okay, you've also living in a society where you have to make money to live and to do all this. Like, there's so many things in our environment that are constantly, like, you know, they're not nice. Okay, and depending on our reaction to them can determine whether we act in a certain way or we react in a certain way. And so there's so many things out there, and because there are so many things, it's almost overwhelming to try and think what it might be. But there might be. It's highly possible that there is something out there that is triggering something, rather than like, oh, it's just your biology that's fucked up.
We have. I think once again back to this whole thing. It's like, fine, there's probably examples where it is mainly like biology, and there's people who actually have some level of biological difference and genetic problems where, you know, they literally can't get out of it. But for the majority, there is a level of like a spectrum of, you know, what are you paying attention to at the moment? You know, what if you're feeling these things, why are you feeling these things? Are you spending too much time comparing yourself? Like, we're all, like, I can't remember what it was. I can't remember I read it, but it's in my head. It's like this idea that we're all really sort of socially switched on, in the sense that we're always looking for like where people stand in specific dimensions, whether it's, I don't know, whether it's the common ones in life at the moment, which is like sort of money and whatever, like where are they, what's their job, what's their occupation, what do they do? Like we're always constantly trying to abstract elements out of people, so not them as a person, not like their experiences, their holidays, you know, what they've done with their life. It's more like very easy to like sort of digest, abstract things, like how much money do they have, what job do they do, what else, how good looking are they? And it's like we abstract out these very sort of surface level attributes, and that's what we're then comparing each other across the board with. We're like, and then the thing about these surface level things as well is they're quite easy to fake. I mean, first of all, in terms of like picture based stuff, you know, you got Photoshop, you got everything like that, so you can enhance your looks. With the wealth stuff as well, you can enhance your perceived wealth with buying goods or renting out Lamborghinis and taking photos. What else is there? In terms of occupation, you could just set up a company on like, you could literally just go buy 10 quid on the gov.uk and be a, you know, managing director of a company which doesn't do anything, but you can still say, look at me, I'm a fucking CEO. So like, there's plenty of ways. This is back to like the fraud I've been reading recently. There's plenty of ways to fake the signals, and we've lost our humanity. Like, we've gone so surface level, like this is what matters, that we forgot like deep down. And this is why I think there's a massive issue with like this like sort of depression culture and stuff, is because these things have been put on a pedestal because of the social media and everything. And then everybody's evaluating himself through those metrics. Well, not everybody, but the people who suffer the most, I reckon, are the ones who evaluate themselves through it, because you're never going to be able to compete with some of these people. Like, in terms of like, looks, genetically, you can't change it. So let's play another dimension then. Money and stuff, fine, like, it's not the be all end all. You're not going to make happiness out of that. So there's plenty of other things that you could actually be looking at. And like, this is where you see people who excel in sports and stuff. This is like other dimensions that people find really fulfilling to follow. And this is why Peterson always talks about, or Jordan Peterson always talks about, like finding something that you can sort of get better at and progress and do stuff. Because that is a treatment to this fucking, you know, to the world at the moment we live in, where everything is hierarchical and it's in the dimensions out almost uncompetable. Or also easy to fake. So that was a mini rant. I don't really know.
No, I think it's interesting. Like, I'm thinking out loud here, but if anyone that is not acting in accordance with how society should act is deemed, there's something wrong with their biology. Okay.
Yeah.
Then society shifts. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
which means that what is the accepted norm will also shift, which means certain people will be left out, and they'll be the outliers, and they'll be deemed as having certain issues. But then, if you think that if we're basing this on biology, then if we're diagnosing people based on like their genetics, let's say, be like, oh, you have a deficiency in, or you're someone who's higher on the end on anxiety, or you're higher on this end or lower on this end, then everyone is deficient in every possible category. So do we end up solving and diagnosing every possible category? Because then if we end up trying to, and this is what he kind of says, like, if you go looking for it, if you go looking to try and create new diseases or, diagnoses, then you're going to find them, because everyone, it once again, it depends what your reference point is.
There's natural variation, mate. This is, I want to get back to this, is the seeing like a state problem. So it's like, and it also talks about it in the fraud book. So basically it talks like, if you've got to manage something, you need to have measurements to work out what's going on, if that makes sense. So like when you go to the doctors, you get a blood test and they measure certain areas of your blood, right? The problem with it is we then get these averages from a wide population, and obviously,
and no one is the average.
Yes, I was about to say that. Nobody is the average. People have different heights, they have different weights, they have all sorts of different measurements. And I'm sure it's the same. It's the same with temperaments, like the way people like feel and go through life. Everybody is fucking different. So to streamline everybody through this dimension of like, this is how much you should have. This is the average. And I get, to be fair, in the medicine, I don't know if you've had like a blood test stuff. They do tend to have like a range. They'll be like, here's a healthy range, which is fine. But I think with in terms of the anxiety and stuff, it's based rather than like actual range of like scientific material stuff. It's like, well, how often do you feel anxious? And then you fill out a form. I guess I feel anxious like 7 to 10 times, a day. But it's not fucking methodical. The guy's not there like ticking off every time they feel anxious, right? And then you get diagnosed off these like qualitative questions. And I'm not saying you can make it quantitative, but like there's an element of it that's like guesswork. And then there's also people have different tolerances. Some people can actually tolerate ambiguity and anxiety better than others. And then it becomes a question of like, why are we then all straitjacketing everybody through these categories of things if we all have different reactions and different things? And it's, I can't remember how we got onto this. 1 second.
Well, because then basically a deficiency or an excess in anything from the norm will be able to be diagnosed.
I was going to say as well, natural variation. So for example, like, let's just say, your blood flow is normal, and then all of a sudden you eat shitloads of sugar and your pressure goes up like this, because I think that's the way it works. And then you do a test. All of a sudden you're fucking hell, this guy's gonna have a heart attack because his blood. But then if you test them again, this is the whole point of testing over time. And it's the same with like these diagnoses. Also, if somebody's going into like thinking they've got ADHD, they're more likely to play up to it on the test to diagnose themselves, because they want to confirm it to themselves almost, right? So there's also a level of game theory in there. Like, if I'm going for a test, it's because I'm assuming I have it. So I'm getting myself tested because I think I have it. Therefore, like, mate, it's like, for example, if you were going to take an IQ test, you'd be like, fucking, I'll get the bloody brain box on today. I'm going to focus and make sure I get the highest IQ test possible. It's the same thing. If you think you've got a problem, the way you're going to act is you're going to act up to the problem because you want to prove to yourself that you have it. Because I was going to say it's an excuse, but anyway, where was I going with that? I'm trying to think where I was going with that. There was a train of thought, I promise, but I've lost it.
Well,
how do we get onto it?
If I get on, in the book, he talks specifically about tests and how they need to be recurring rather than cross-sectional at one point in time, because it doesn't. You don't have anything to compare it to.
I've now got it back. It was this idea of natural variations. Like another time, like let's just say something big happens in your life. You're then depressed for a while. Let's say somebody you love passed away. That's a fairly natural reaction.
Yeah.
And you can often deal with it yourself. So there's a bit of like, this is actually reminds me of Taleb, where it talks about like intervention bias. So it's like, let's just say it's natural variation. At this moment in your life, you've been eating unhealthy. So you're bound to get worse results. But if you'd solved the problem yourself and you got it down by eating healthy, you don't need the doctor. We're so quick to intervene in things like, oh my God, you've had anxiety for a week now. Fucking let's just get you on the bloody antidepressants or whatever it is that calms. Don't shoot me. I don't know. But at the same time, it's like sometimes stuff can figure itself out. And before these psychiatrists exist, it often did. Do Do you get what I mean? It
Yeah.
often figured itself out, but now we've become this society where everything has to be intervened in.
Yeah.
Like, this is a problem. Like, the thing is, with this measurement, it's like this fetishization of data and fetishization of numbers. We've got a number, or we've got this diagnosis. Now, instead of re-diagnosing every, for a month, you should actually, realistically, you should be spending a month every day doing some form of like reporting on yourself to work out if you actually have a problem.
Yeah.
The more data points, the more likely it's accurate.
Absolutely, yeah.
So, if you have a really bad week and you then go and get yourself tested for depression or something, you're more likely to. And I'm not saying that your depression is going to go away, because I know it doesn't work like that.
Yeah.
But there's many reasons why you could have it, or you're feeling like it, and sometimes it takes a second thought, or trying to take it over a longer period of time. And don't get me wrong, I'm sure there's plenty of people who actually literally experience it for like months on end and then go to the doctors, and then it's it's fine. But I think for me, I always I'm trying to argue against unnecessary treatments and unnecessary diagnosis. Yes, anything which you might be able to deal with yourself. And this is, once again, not. I always feel like I have to say this. I feel like people are going to shoot me for like saying that. I don't, it's not like I don't believe.
We're not doctors. Okay, we're not prescribing it.
Yeah, but I mean, you don't need to even be a doctor to figure this out. And the problem is with doctors and psychiatrists as well, is they're all biased to, like you just said, their structure.
And they're bound to the system that they're in. I find it nuts that like when a doctor is saying something, he has to, he can only say it if it fits within the system, but someone else just has to say it.
I was about to say, why do you think they have third-party audits in terms of like when it comes to like financial statements? The whole point is you have somebody who doesn't have skin in the game in that knowledge structure or in the industry to criticize, because if you don't have that, then how can you hold people accountable? Yeah. Because the people in the industry obviously aren't going to be like, oh, this is a fucking joke. Yeah. They're going to be like, oh no, well, not that the fucking medicine's a joke at all, but you know what I mean? They're not going to admit their own errors, because why would they?
I think, like, I always going back to what you were just saying before, I always use like the example of like divorce as an example of like divorce has become much easier. Yeah. And so instead of sticking with a problem, sometimes people straight away will like jump ship, because they have that option there. The optionality is there. So I always, it's the same thing with this. It's like, if the option is there, realistically, people should stick it out to make sure whether they need it or not. But a lot of the time we end up just resorting to the quickest option, the quickest solution, and be like, oh yeah, okay, that will solve it. Rather than actually sticking with it. And like you just said, you should do something for an amount of time to actually see if you have a problem first, or if you can't solve it yourself, and then try and seek help.
I have to say as well, like in terms of let's just use ADHD as an example as well, in terms of like, obviously a lot more people have been diagnosed with it, but I think that definitely comes from like, your body's impelled, as we know, to seek like novelty to a degree. It's like trying to, searching for information, searching for like, something that's going to give you like a positive response or feedback in your body. So I will almost want to argue the reason why the ADHD is getting more diagnosed is because obviously you go on your phone, immediately there's something there that can hold your attention. So the moment you go here and you get bored, you pick up something else, because your brain is constantly scanning, like, give me some novelty, give me this, give me that, give me the dopamine hit, right? So ADHD is almost like or almost comes because of the fact that we all have our attention split, because there's just so many things we could be doing every second. We are like completely bombarded. And then the argument is it biological or is it fucking environmental? Well, funnily enough, it wasn't an issue before phones and the internet came around. Exactly. I wonder why that is. And then we treat it with drugs to make people like fucking focus. It's like, well, okay, I don't know if that's the solution. Yeah.
And and the side effects of like Ritalin and things like that.
Yeah. My Flynn takes a load of bloody I'm pretty sure he's on Ritalin. Like he takes.
I think it's an emotional suppressant as well.
Yeah, I think it might be, but it's just really fascinating, because to me it's very self-evident that it's like I've noticed my attention span over the years has got worse and worse and worse, and it continues to get worse because of the fact that it's like every second, like every time there's he talks about it a lot in like these habit books. Every time your brain has a moment where like there's a barrier to doing something. So let's say I was going to do something on my laptop and it was particularly hard, like I hadn't done it before. So my brain goes, oh, that's hard. It's going to require effort, but I can hit a novel. I can get like this dopamine hit if I just grab a phone now. Yeah. So immediately, like next thing you know, you're scrolling. You're like, what the fuck am I doing?
Well, I say this in terms of like people don't read anymore, or people can't read anymore. Like they literally can't sustain their attention for more than like 10 minutes. Why do you think like we've gone less and less, shorter and shorter videos, until now we're at TikToks.
Oh yeah,
10-second
buddy.
videos. It's like,
Yeah, mate. It's because obviously I'm doing Facebook ads for like Slidify, and it's funny. We were speaking to like the Facebook marketer, and he's like, "Oh my god, you've got a really long video." And I was like, "What do you mean?" He's like, "Yeah, 28 seconds is a really long video." I was like, "Are you fucking kidding me?" Like for advertising, that is. And I was like, "How has the world got to this point now where they're literally 28 seconds?" I thought that was too short, to be honest.
But also, what I find ridiculous, right, is that we end up playing towards that. It's like, oh, we know people only have an attention span of 10 seconds, so we'll make all our custom like animation stuff for 10 seconds. But it's
but not even just
everyone has to try and jump, you know?
Yeah, we know their attention span's 10 seconds, so how can we get their attention immediately and try and hold it? So we scare them. This is like the whole way the media's set up. Like the whole way everything's set up at the moment with the clickbait.
Yeah.
Like,
it's nuts.
I don't know. This, I mean, I don't want to be society.
Anyway, that was a bit of a segue.
I think
that's pretty much the crux of.
Yeah, there's a load of stuff here that I got about like rule following behavior, but I don't think it's relevant. I don't think it's relevant to this conversation. I think one of the cool things we don't really touch on is this idea of language and proto-language. I don't know if you took the notes on that, where like he talks about, you know, obviously language, what I'm using now to explain stuff, is a more rational, it's more of a, what's the best way of putting it? It's more direct communication, relatively. I mean, you can use it to be indirect. But he then talks about proto-language, which is the things before language, which is like emotional reactions, tonality. So he talks about like how, you know, if somebody can't get something through language, they then result to proto-language, which can be weeping. It can be basically being like, so, right, I'm going to try and explain it. When you're a baby, how do you get things you want? You weep, you cry, you make a scene, you do things which basically show desperation to get care. So his point here is, if you can't get what you want with language, what a lot of people tend to resort to is back to the default baby style or child style, which has become needy, like, you know, act as if you're a kid. And that's quite interesting, because a lot of this mental illness, or some of the stuff he talks about particularly, can be seen as a lot of people like crying for help and becoming, basically victimizing themselves because it's the only way they can get the things they want, such as like love and care. So if you look at actually like relatively toxic relationships, you would see that if you talk about somebody who's clingy, or somebody who's, you know, in a relationship who's not quite emotionally stable, you will see their behavior turn to like childlike.
Yeah, exactly.
And that is the proto-language speaking.
There's I've got like a little section here. The point is that when some persons in some situations cannot make themselves heard by means of ordinary language, for example, speech or writing, they may try to make themselves heard by means of proto-language, for example, weeping or symptoms. Others in other situations may try to overcome this obstacle in exactly the opposite way. That is, by shifting from ordinary language spoken in a normal tone of voice to ordinary language spoken in a shout or in a threatening tone. Yeah. And it is interesting because, like, it makes sense. You know, it's like you need to get heard, and so the tool that you're using to express what you want isn't working. So
then you go back into the primitive sort of behavior. So what do animals, when they can't communicate? They do two things. They either like pretend to be really weak for help from for family support, or they get fucking aggressive to get what they want. And it's so obvious. You see it in people. Like, if they can't get what they want, they throw their toys out the pram, whatever the saying is. They get really angry and they get aggressive. That's a domination approach. Or they get really fucking submissive, just really try and hope to get it right. And that is proto-language. It's the stuff before language. It's communication, which isn't explicit, but it's also implicit in the sense that when you act like that, you're implying that you need something, or you're implying that you're going to hurt them.
And he ties this in with the whole idea of like seeing signs.
Yeah.
You know, in order for like a psychiatrist to diagnose you, he looks at the signs of what, you know, you're showing in order to diagnose something. And if the signs are being shown just because you can't be heard, and so you're using a proto-language, well, then his interpretation may be wrong.
Yeah. With the stuff like that, I never really got around to how they actually use that as to infer stuff. I guess if somebody came in and was really submissive, then they could like look at them through a lens of, you know, maybe they're fine. Well, if they're submissive, they're trying to get heard. They're being submissive to try and get care, aren't they? So I guess that's how you do it. And if they're being dominating, they're trying to get care through the same way, or they're trying to get a particular goal through a different strat.
And interestingly, like you go back to the 60s, and men were, I think, especially in the US, were legally allowed to admit their wife into a mental hospital for hysteria. And so it's interesting that, like, basically, if you think about it, right, someone's having like marital problems, and then they're like, oh, there's something wrong with my wife. She needs to see a psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist interprets that body language as something else. Then it's interesting how
that's a really perverse incentive structure.
Yeah.
So basically, I can see why a load of people would have thrown their wives in. The males don't get what they want; they throw their wives into a mental hospital. That's fucking crazy. That was even allowed. Like, this is back to the. Well, we'll wrap up on this probably, mate, because I do need to go soon. This book on like the fraud and stuff, and like how systematic fraud is never even perceived as fraud, even after the fact, because there's nobody to blame. If the incentive system is literally like, oh well, you can throw your wife in a mental hospital for hysteria if she's acting weird, you can just create all sorts of reasons. Let's just say you don't agree with the fact she's maybe you're having less sex than you used to be, and you're really disappointed with your marriage, or maybe she's got old and you don't want to divorce her, so you're like, I'm just going to then be like, oh, okay, she's got mental issues. Like, you've set up the structure to allow people to abuse it. And this is the whole, this is why I'm kind of like, I used to be so anti, like I said to you yesterday, anti-regulation, anti all this, but now I've realized it's there because otherwise you have structures or incentive structures where people just take the piss because they can. They just like they see the goal they want and they just find any way to achieve it. I'm not convinced everybody's like that, but there's enough out there to defraud things and create systematic, issues. But that's absolutely crazy.
I think.
But in fact, do you know what? If anything, right, this topic you could even argue is just one big one of these.
No, I know that's what I was going to say. Like, it is, and it goes back to what we were saying earlier on. Is like, it is about how a system is created. In this sense, in terms of fraud, you need to constantly update. You need to be saying like, well, what's happening here? Are people taking advantage of this system, and why might that be? Do we need to sort it out? And that's the same with this. And it's like, clearly, after a long time, when these things haven't been updated or actually looked at, they're so ingrained and they're so taken for, like, it's automatic that people don't even question it anymore.
I also don't want to say it isn't far-fetched for so I don't particularly like the conspiracy theorist stuff. I think if everything makes too much sense, it's not right. Like, if something's so clear cut, it's wrong. But at the same time, I can obviously see how, from reading this fraud book about the Vioxin and how medical companies obviously create a drug for a specific treatment. And obviously for them, it makes way more sense to just invent new illnesses to treat, because if they do that, they can sell more of their drug. So it's quite interesting. I wonder how the ADHD bucket has grown in terms of what constitutes ADHD. Because even I now think I'm on the spectrum ADHD, but I don't even have I literally just have struggle of attention because of the fact that I got so many different things going on. So do I have ADHD or do I just have a lot of problems that I have to figure out? Like, it's interpretation, right? And I'm sure if I went to a doctor, they would absolutely be prescribing me Ritalin, everything.
Absolutely.
And then it's a bit like, well, hang on a second. Do I really need to go straight down to the sort of drug sort of stuff? And I guarantee, like, once again, it's one of these things they probably created for very specific people who had actual problems, who needed it, who actually need it. And now it's spread out to be like, oh, but it can also treat this. And the side effects aren't that bad. Only 5 people have a heart attack, or something like that. I'm not convinced it's a conspiracy. I'm just convinced, like we're just talking about now, the system, is set up in a way that encourages that. And that's the end of it. It's not that there's sinister people out there. It's just the incentives are laid out in front of them. How can we make more money? Because we are a publicly traded company. We are liable to our shareholders to increase value. How do we increase value? How do we make more profits? We sell more stuff. Okay, how do we sell more stuff? We take the stuff we already have because we've already spent a fuckload of money researching it and creating it, and then we create more reasons why to use it. Oh, look, it helps you focus, but it also helps you memorize stuff. Okay, let's make a memory pill. Bang. You struggle with memory, let's go.
Exactly.
The scope creeps.
I think it's interesting because, like, he was quite angry in the book.
He was very angry. He calls it the pharmacracy at the end, doesn't he?
But in a way, I think that there are, like, ruthless people out there who don't care about it. But I think a majority of the people just aren't even aware. They're in this field that is nested in a system that has taken the field in the wrong trajectory. And they're none the wiser. And I think that is something, and he's basically saying, like, the overarching idea of this book is that there's way more complexity to diagnosing someone than straight away just like jumping on the bandwagon.
Because everybody has their own story, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So like, there's way more complexity in the sense that everybody has their own personal issues and their own personal problems, which is what you're actually diagnosing and not the actual underlying biology. Is somebody there or?
No, it was my dad just came in.
Okay. I want to end with the thing I quite liked at the end. I highlighted it was like the old quacks peddled fake cures to treat real diseases, and there's like the new quacks peddled fake diseases to justify chemical pacification and medical coercion. It's pretty strong. But
that whole paragraph I highlighted.
Yeah, it gets even better. It's like the old quacks are politically harmless. They could harm individuals only with the individual's consent. The new quacks are a serious threat to individual liberty and personal responsibility. They're agents of the therapeutic state who can and do harm individuals both with and without the consent. It's funny because back to what I always say to you is like, if you remove the semantics of things and you just describe what's going on. Just describe it. So a lot of people are now being diagnosed with things. Okay, diagnosed with all these sort of mental diseases. And then if you boil down to like what his argument here is, don't get me wrong, there is aspects where mental diseases do exist, but are they more common now than they were before? Then you ask yourself, why is that? Are the diagnoses sort of growing in scope? Also, like we said earlier, the more people that get diagnosed, the more they're like, okay, I might actually have that myself. I've experienced, anxiety, which we all experience from time to time, right?
Absolutely.
I've experienced it quite a lot recently, so maybe I should go get checked. And this is how it kind of like works out. And that, like I say again, don't get me wrong, people do actually have these things, but at the same time, not as many as I think is being diagnosed and being treated, because the incentives, once again, for the psychiatrist to stay in business is to be like, right, yeah, you've definitely got this problem. We'll help you sort it out.
Yeah.
And,
but also it changes an individual's perspective of how to cope with these things, right? Because it's like now it's like almost accepted as like, if you have anxiety, you can go and get it sorted out somewhere else, rather than like, if you have anxiety, let's sort it out here right now.
Well, everything's been biologicized. It doesn't really work. Medicalized, that will work. Just everything has. Like, any problem you have is all of a sudden, okay, there's a drug that can dampen that emotion or do this and do that. At what cost? Are you really actually dealing with the issues?
And should we not be more promoting, self-growth and self-improvement in areas like that, so that once you've sorted out that area, then you can tell if something is getting biologically causing something.
It's pretty deep on that. I honestly, if anybody actually listened all the way to the end, I just hope that people actually just, for me, it's just more questioning it. It's just this is it. I don't particularly like we're trying to say the whole time. He literally doesn't believe in illness at all, mental illness.
No, he doesn't.
He doesn't think it exists. Whereas I would say it does.
Well, mental illness, because there's no such thing as a mind illness, because a mind is
fine.
An abstract.
You're right. There is a brain imbalance. In fact, that's what they call it anyway. Brain imbalances, isn't it? It's like an imbalance of neurotransmitters. But anyway, the crux of it is technically, if you think about what an illness is defined as, and if the mental illnesses exist, they don't. It's just a metaphor to strap on the same perception of like all the structure of illness to mental procedures, which doesn't exactly map. That's his point. I thought it was really fucking interesting.
Same.
It's one of the most relatively eye-opening books I thought about, and it really, especially reading the stuff around trauma as well, and just being more aware in your personal life and start thinking like, am I depressed right now, or am I like, is there other reasons for it? I'm really sort of like, at the moment, like try and be really sort of switched on with how I'm feeling and my energy levels. Like I've noticed even like 2 beers, the next day my energy levels will be down. I'm just trying to work out and I'm trying to associate lack of energy with drinking, so it stops you from doing it. So like you sit there and you're like, you see a beer and you're like, oh, I don't like that, because I can already feel tomorrow the energy loss. Well, I don't know how I moved on to that, but it's definitely worth reading. And like every book you ever read, you don't have to fucking take it as gospel. It's just interesting to consider if it is true, what the implications are. And he has very interesting and good points. So that, my friend, I think is a wrap.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that, guys. I know it was quite the controversial topic today, so I would love to hear from you, whether you agreed, whether you disagreed, why that might be. I want to integrate you into the process of reviewing these books. We want to hear your perspective. The more perspectives, the better. Also, if you did enjoy it, make sure you give us a like, leave a comment. follow us, subscribe. That way you will be made aware when we are next uploading another episode. I think the next one is going to be a Rome recap, and we're doing something new whereby we review the very short introduction Oxford books. So recently, Jess and I, we've read The Intelligence, and we're going to be reviewing that, and that's going to be coming out on Friday. So if that sounds interesting, make sure you stay tuned. But until then, have a good one.